if I have a trainee holding the laryngoscope and the endotracheal tube, if they're using an old school Mac or Miller, it's really hard for me to see what they're seeing versus if they're using a video scope where I can just look at the screen and provide them guidance kind of in real time.
Yeah, exactly. It's very nerve-wracking to watch somebody intubate DL when you're responsible for it, because you're basically waiting for that capnography trace to tell you if they got it. Welcome to Critical Care Time, the podcast for everyone who cares for people with critical illness. I'm your host, Dr. Nick Mark.
And I'm Dr. Cyrus. On this week's episode, we're going to have another journal club, finally. I know it's been a while, so thanks for being patient with us. And we are going to talk about the recent device trial.
As we've said on this show before, airway management is probably the highest stakes procedure that we regularly perform in critically ill people. Having more data to guide us is probably a very good thing.
Absolutely, Nick. Arguably every intubation we do, whether it's in the ED or the ICU, the wards, or frankly in the back of an ambulance, it's a high-risk procedure because they're typically going to be unplanned, in patients that are decompensating, in patients that may have multiple medical comorbidities. So it's definitely a potentially scary situation, and more data is better to drive our decision-making.
Yeah, and listeners can go back to episode 11, the physiologically difficult airway, where we spell out some of those risks and talk about ways to reduce the risks. Today, we're not going to talk about things to do with the physiology. Today, we're going to talk really more about the devices, the how you get the plastic through the cords.
That's right, Nick. And while I think we can all agree that those intubations in critical care are tricky, challenging, risky in and of themselves, what's also interestingly challenging and tricky is coming to a consensus on how to manage these airways.
Right. You put 3 airway experts in a room and you're going to get at least 4 different opinions about what the best approach is.
And, to take that one step further, I guess one of the common areas of disagreement is what kind of laryngoscope should we be using as our default approach? And so there's really, I think, 2 camps here. You've got the proponents of DL or direct laryngoscopy, which is mostly anesthesiologists, who argue that it is simpler, it's cheaper, it's more widely available, and it works for most airways if you know how to use it. And DL proponents will also say that delivery of the endotracheal tube is easier with DL and that intubations are faster because in that case, you don't have to change the way you attack the airway. You're looking straight at the airway and you're able to just kind of drive the tube right at what you're seeing. Now, conversely, proponents of video laryngoscopy or VL will argue that it achieves a better view of the cords more reliably. And so, especially in folks that are less frequent intubators, it actually makes for an easier experience, and it makes it ultimately easier to get the tube in place.
Yeah, I thought one of the interesting things from this paper that we'll get into in a second was they talk about how at baseline, about 80% of ED and ICU intubations are being performed with direct laryngoscopy. But VL is clearly growing in popularity. And full disclosure, I'm a big believer in VL. I think that VL is superior. I do about 50 intubations a year, and I probably do 1 or 2 with DL. Just disclosing what side of the fence I'm on.
Yeah, and I think it's important for our listeners to know kind of where our biases lie, and also for us to acknowledge that while anecdote is great, sometimes it's nice to actually have some data. And so fortunately, in this case, we can introduce the direct versus video laryngoscopy study that was recently done, aka the device trial.
Yes, and before we jump in, I'd just like to commend the authors for not trying to make that acronym work. Like, there is no attempt at a backronym there. Like, if you want that C in device to be in there, you'd have to make it like the C in laryngoscope. So good job. Clearly, we're not cardiologists. We don't have a crazy backronym game.
All right, Nick. So now that we've done a little bit of introduction, do you want to walk us through this trial?
Absolutely. So DeVice was a pragmatic, multicenter, randomized controlled trial of about 1,400 critically ill adults at 17 EDs and ICUs in the U.S. They randomized patients to either video laryngoscopy, VL, or direct laryngoscopy, DL. About 70% of the intubations were done in the ED, 30% in the ICU. Interestingly, 95% of the intubations were performed by either residents or fellows. And also importantly, the majority of VL intubations, about 85%, were performed using a standard geometry blade, not a hyperangulated blade. And if you look by facility, it varied a little bit, but about half the time, about 55% of the time, they used a bougie, and the other half they used a stylet. So there were some differences in approach, but I think overall it's pretty representative of how most people do VL. Their primary outcome was successful first pass intubation, which occurred in 85% in the VL group versus 70% in the DL group. That 15% difference was highly significant.
Excellent. Really another way you can look at that is essentially if you intubate 6 people, 4 out of 6 times you'll get it on the first attempt if you approach them with direct laryngoscopy versus 5 out of 6 times if you approach them with video laryngoscopy.
Right. So the number needed to treat to get one additional first pass success is 6, which is a pretty significant clinical effect size, I would say. One other thing to emphasize is that the effect was so significant that the trial was stopped early for efficacy. And if you read the supplement, they explain their methodology for this, and they tell you that what the p-value is. Now, normally on this show, we don't like to talk p-values. We don't like to fetishize them, blah, 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 blah. But in this case, just this once, I think it's worth saying that the p-value for their interim analysis was 0.00000007. 7 zeros, right? That's like, 5 sigma significance. This is like, we've just discovered a new Higgs boson type physics territory. So very, very large effect, very significant.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. And, it's also kind of interesting that, there are very few studies that are actually stopped early for efficacy, especially in critical care. I mean, there are a few examples like the ARMA trial, which is, the kind of landmark trial that ushered in the era of lung protective ventilation in the setting of ARDS. There's the study that looked at non-invasive, I can't remember what the name of that one was, but looking at non-invasive positive pressure ventilation after extubation.
There was the recovery trial, of course, which showed steroids in COVID.
Recovery, and then Cape Cod, another steroid trial looking at steroids in severe community-acquired pneumonia. So, a few studies there that really those are the only ones that I can immediately kind of think of.
Yeah, basically, it's pretty unusual to see a big randomized controlled critical care study stopped early for efficacy. It's something that probably comes along every 2 to 3 years. So right off the bat, this is a result that we should probably pay attention to.
Okay, so that's all well and good, but let's take a quick little detour and ask about secondary endpoints.
Yeah. So we said the primary endpoint was first pass success. One secondary endpoint was the view achieved. So far more patients in the video laryngoscopy group achieved a Cormack-Lehane grade 1 view, so the best possible view of entire vocal cords. And it was 76% versus 44%. So 30% of people got a grade 1 view, 30% more got a grade 1 view. There were also fewer grade 3 or 4 views, only 4% in the VL group as opposed to 20% with DL. So you were more likely to get a good view and you were much less likely to get a bad view.
Okay. I mean, that sounds like good data. What about time to intubation? Was there a difference there?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. I think this is one of the most important takeaways from the study, in fact. So the median duration of intubation, which was defined as the number of seconds between the start of laryngoscopy and intubation of the trachea, as measured by an observer, was 38 seconds in the VL group versus 46 seconds in the DL group. So it was actually faster to intubate using VL rather than DL.
Interesting. Okay, so not only did we get a better view with video laryngoscopy, but the time it took to actually get the tube in place was shorter.
Exactly.
Okay. And then what about any sort of subgroup analysis, Nick?
So the authors had a couple of pre-specified subgroups that they looked at. I think the most important one was breaking it down by the amount of prior airway experience each operator had. And they found that the improvement in first pass success with VL was larger for more novice operators. Specifically, people with fewer than 25 prior intubations were 26% more likely to succeed on the first pass compared to more experienced operators with greater than 100 prior intubations, where the difference was only about 6%.
Interesting.
And so, I think the question we should ask ourselves now that we kind of talked about the key points here is, first of all, do we believe these results? Do we think they're applicable to us, to our practice?
Yeah. So I think It's interesting too. Like I'm just kind of pondering on what you just said in regards to the difference between more novice intubators versus those that are more experienced. And generally speaking, those that are more experienced are going to be, like when I think of the most experienced airway operators, I think of anesthesiologists in particular, and they tend to be the ones that are in that DL camp, if you will. So I guess there's, I know where there's a little bit of apples to oranges here, but I suppose, but that this hints at perhaps, why they may feel that way. They may not have that same boon to their stats, if you will, when using video laryngoscopy versus direct laryngoscopy. At least that's maybe somewhat alluded to by this data. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I guess one big caveat that they make in the paper as well is that
Mm-hmm.
this is not really applicable to the OR. This is
Yeah.
studies. This is a study done in the ED and the ICU. So nobody is telling anesthesiologists what to do in the OR. What we're saying is that for high risk, usually unplanned emergency intubations done in the ED and the ICU, VL is more likely to get you a first pass success, whether you are inexperienced or more experienced. Now, I think some people looking at this paper will say, yeah, but the confidence interval on that greater than 100 intubations group crossed one. So I'm throwing that
Mm-hmm.
out. And I just want to push back on that, for a couple statistical reasons and make a larger point. So this is a subgroup. The trial was not powered to detect a significant difference there, but the point estimate was still positive, right? So you can't say it didn't detect a difference because it was underpowered. And in fact, it was even more underpowered because the trial was stopped early for benefit. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not a fair criticism to say this subgroup didn't achieve significance. Every single subgroup they looked at showed a benefit to VL over DL, admittedly smaller in more experienced intubators. Um, yeah, I think that you can look at it and you can say, oh, it's greater than 0.05, so it's not significant. I don't have to pay attention to it, but that's just not how subgroups work. And I think we have to look at the overall trend.
Great point, Nick.
I guess one other interesting point to make is that um, one criticism of VL by proponents of DL would say that visualizing the chords is easier, but passing the tube is harder. But importantly, that is not at all what this study found.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point, and it kind of pokes a significant hole in the argument that you just outlined. The operators reported that the reason for failure was inability to pass a bougie or ET tube in 7% of VL intubations and 7.2% of DL intubations. So really, there was no significant difference there at all.
Right. So, yeah, in fact, numerically slightly fewer problems with tube delivery in the VL group. So I think that pretty much busts the myth that it's easy to see but hard to pass the tube. I think an important caveat is that about half the time they were using bougies. And so, that is one potential solution to that problem. So I think it's worth remembering that if you're going to use VL, you should either use a bougie as your default or just have one readily available because it often mitigates that challenge.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't disagree at all. And I think, moving on to other criticisms of VL that I think we need to discuss is this idea of, okay, it takes longer. And I I will admit that at least in my experience, it does take longer in the sense of like you have to get the device and plug it in and make sure that it's kind of like working and all that. But generally, if you've got a well-oiled machine, that's not really that much time. And in fact, what they were really looking at was it takes longer from time of intubation, not the setup element. And
Right.
and with respect to that, they actually saw that from the time of laryngoscope insertion to tube insertion, it was 38 seconds in the VL group versus 46 seconds in the DL group. So totally the opposite of that argument that's often made.
Yeah, and so I think some people might ask, does an 8-second difference in time to success matter? Well, I would answer by saying, ask the 49ers. If that game had been over 8 seconds sooner, we would have a different Super Bowl champion. So 8 seconds can be a lot of time. I think 8 seconds can be a lot of time when you're intubating somebody.
Oh,
Um, I don't think I don't think it mattered much in this study. If you look at the secondary endpoints like the incidence of severe hypoxemia, cardiac arrest, things like that, those were similar between groups. So it wasn't like VL, was safer than DL, even though it was a little faster. But in principle, I think it could be.
yeah. I definitely think that's a good point. And, I can imagine that, 8 seconds faster could very much make a difference in a patient that's hypoxemic at baseline. When I think about those patients during the height of the pandemic who, despite our best efforts, we could hardly get them to a sat of 90 prior to inducing them with everything we could possibly do non-invasively, and then they drop their sats the moment they go apneic, and it's like this huge disaster and a lot of sphincter tightening, etc. So I think in those folks, every second really does matter.
Right. And I think it's also important to remember that that's a median of 8 seconds. So there are patients where it was a lot faster, 30, 35, 40 seconds faster. And so that's a difference I really do care about.
Mm-hmm.
I think one other criticism that you might hear, some listeners might be saying, well, that's all well and good, but improved first pass success is nice, but is that really the endpoint that we should care about?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I've kind of been grappling with this as well. At face value, perhaps first pass success isn't necessarily a patient-centered endpoint, but I think in some cases it could be, depending on how you look at it. I mean, what's your thought on it, Nick?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's an endpoint which is easier to study. Um, if I'm a patient and I get intubated on the first try or the second try, as long as there's no complications, I probably don't, A, I don't know the difference, and B, I probably don't care about the difference. But I think we got to think practically for a second here, which is that, you have to do the study, right? And so this is something that you can measure in every single patient. If you were trying to detect the severe hypoxemia, cardiac arrest, death as your primary endpoint, this would have to be just an absolutely enormous study in order to find that difference.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think there's a lot of interest in doing like a 10,000 person study to look at mortality when comparing VL versus DL. So really, I think this is probably the best we're going to get, realistically speaking, and the strongest evidence that we can hope to attain.
Yeah. So bottom line, should the device trial change our practice, Cyrus?
Yeah, I think, well, again, full disclosure, I think for both of us, we tend towards VL at baseline. So for Nick, Mark, and Cyrus asking, I don't know that it's going to necessarily change our
Yes,
practice,
it confirms what I already do.
Right.
It's like that joke about, papers, there's only two outcomes to a journal club, right? Like, I knew that already, or I don't believe it. And, I knew that already.
Right. Yeah. I think this is definitely practice affirming for us, but I think for in broad strokes, I think, like for me as an educator, and Nick, for you as an educator, we do work with a lot of trainees, various stages in their training, and so I think this definitely supports the practice of training them on a video laryngoscopy platform and getting them comfortable with that. There seems to be very good, compelling data to proceed in that way. There's strong evidence here that you get a better view, you get that view faster, and you have better success. And really, again, getting back to that academic element of it, if I have a trainee holding the laryngoscope and the endotracheal tube, it's really hard if they're using like an old school Mac or Miller. It's really hard for me to see what they're seeing versus if they're using a video scope where I can just look at the screen and provide them guidance kind of in real time.
Yeah, exactly. It's very nerve-wracking to watch somebody intubate DL when you're responsible for it, because you're basically waiting for that capnography trace to tell you if they got it. It's like, I believe you, but I don't trust you until I see that trace. As opposed to VL, where you're really watching the tube go in, you can give them feedback. Hey, try this manipulation. So it's a completely different experience supervising somebody who's a novice intubator, VL versus DL. One point to add to that too is you're able to record it, right? So you can give them feedback in the moment. You can also give them feedback after the moment, and I think that is a huge opportunity with VL that just doesn't exist at all with DL. One other interesting point, I guess, is, I think the more experienced clinicians, especially people who come from an anesthesia background and work in an ICU, maybe saying, do I really need to switch to VL, right? Like, I've done hundreds, thousands of airways, like, why should I switch, and I think the answer to that is, look, this study showed pretty conclusively that there is no situation where DL is superior. There's no subgroup, there's no patient group, right? Even among the most experienced operators, those with greater than 250 intubations, VL is still better than DL, right? The point estimate was still positive. And so I don't think that rationale makes a lot of sense. I think, if I think it is very valuable to be good at DL technique, and I think it is useful to practice DL using VL. And
Mhm.
what I mean by that is you should use a standard geometry blade, and you don't have to look at the screen. You can have the screen there as a backup, but you can intubate using, a view down the scope. Um, and that, this camera is there if you need it, but you don't
Mhm.
have to use it. And this is a really valuable skill because it means that you're actually practicing both skills. You have the safety advantage of VL, but you have the skills maintenance of DL. I guess one other meta point I would make too is that, contrary to what experts might say, every experienced operator was once a novice. So
Very
hopefully
true.
from this point moving forward, most novices are going to be getting most or all of their experience with VL. And so, I don't know what it means to be an expert in the future, 5 years from now, right? If you've done 300 intubations in that time, but they were all with VL, I don't think, quote, being an expert means you should just like abandon VL and switch to DL at that point. Maybe the analogy here is kind of like, when ultrasound became standard of care for internal jugular central lines. Experienced operators had a very low complication rate for that. Most of the benefit of ultrasound in central lines was for less experienced operators. But
Mhm.
after a certain number of years go by, everybody's experience is using ultrasound. So you would never be like, hey, I've done 1,000 of these. Like, I don't have to use ultrasound anymore.
Yeah, Nick, I think that's a great point. As we're not comparing apples to oranges here, but I can't really, unless it was a subclavian line, I can't really remember the last time I placed central line without ultrasonographic visualization.
Right.
Um,
And
and it's
confirmation.
kind of like in confirmation, right? And you can see the wire and all that. I mean, I want to get too off into the weeds here because I know we want to talk about that as a separate, episode in the future is, tips and tricks for central lines. But point being is, it's that age old question of just because you can do something, should you? And in this case, like, yeah, I can probably do it one way, but there's objective evidence to support doing it a different way. And so I guess if you really want to be almost draconian about it, it's like, well, if you have a bad outcome in the setting of this data, how easy is it to defend, that you sort of like opted to not follow what trends and data suggest. And I don't think that's happening in real life because it is a totally viable approach. But at least for me, it being direct laryngoscopy. But for me, it's just like when I look at this data, I don't think I would be able to just be okay with like, you know, accepting defeat, not using the modality that has been now I would say well documented in the literature as being the preferred approach.
Yes, I agree. So Cyrus, can you put the device trial into context for us? Like, how does this compare with other trials that have been done on the subject? I know you've done some research on that.
Yeah, so there have been other trials that I've come across, and I really I guess I'll actually point us to a few meta-analyses that are nice. Now remember, the thing with meta-analyses is there's sort of a double-edged sword because it's nice because you're able to derive conclusions from a population the size of which you might not otherwise have access to. Because especially with device trials, those study groups can often be in the hundreds or maybe the low thousands, things like that, if you're lucky. So you essentially like increase the size of your population. The downside, however, is that it's essentially impossible to account for every variation between every study when you're doing a meta-analysis. And so I think the data that I think the conclusion that you come to needs to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt in that sense. Um,
Yeah, I
that
think
being
as
said,
a quick side note there, the most important part of a meta-analysis, in my opinion, as somebody who's done meta-analyses, is your quality analysis of the studies you include. Because meta-analyses
Mhm.
have a really, really big danger of being garbage in, garbage out, or GIGO, if you like the
Mhm.
acronym, right? Like, if you do a meta-analysis of 10 terrible studies, you will draw a statistically significant terrible conclusion. So it really matters what the studies in the meta-analysis are.
That's very true. And I had an attending once that said like, your meta-analysis is only as good as your weakest kind of constituent. I think that's not statistically true, because the idea, the idea is that you're going to have hopefully a preponderance of good studies and maybe a couple not so good. So it does skew in the right direction. But the idea there, I think, is a valid one. It's that like you really need to at least endeavor to incorporate well-designed, strong studies in your meta-analysis. So with that being said, there are two that I wanted to discuss. There's one from 2023. This was a meta-analysis looking at 15 studies, and it was published in the Canadian Journal of Anesthesia. So we'll make sure we have a link to that on our website. And it looked at nearly 2,300 patients, and specifically they looked at real patients, so not mannequins, actual patient encounters, and they were looking at VL versus DL in the hands of novices, which they defined as either being residents, and that was in 10 studies, or medical students, which was 5 studies. And in that study, or I should say in that meta-analysis, they found significance in non-patient-centered outcomes, so that would be visualization of various elements of the airway, as well as that all-important time to intubation, which I would say time to intubation is, in my mind, very much a patient-centered outcome. The longer it takes you to get that airway, the more badness can occur, and so I care about that.
Yep.
So really, in that case, VL outperformed DL from top to bottom, from soup to nuts. Then, if you want something a little more recent than 2023, you can look to this study that I found in January of 2024, and this looked at this looked at over 5,000 patients spread throughout 8 different studies. And again, in that meta-analysis, so it's kind of a similar approach also to the other one. I don't think that they focused on just novices there, though, if memory serves. But 5,000 patients looking at VL versus DL. And again, VL was kind of crowned as being superior. So they looked here at first, so here they looked at success on first attempt, and that was significantly higher for VL than DL. It was 81.5 versus 68%. And there, I know we're not here to fetishize p-values, but the p-value again was essentially 0. It was so infinitesimally small. And then then the other thing though that I think is important here is that they cited there was no correlation between VL and severe hypoxemia, severe hypotension, or cardiac arrest. And so to me, that speaks directly to those folks that are like, oh, VL is going to take longer, and so the likelihood of something bad happening is greater. Well, that just really wasn't demonstrated in this meta-analysis, and I think that's pretty cool. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, I agree. I think that a lot of the concerns raised by proponents of DL are effectively debunked by the device study and this other meta-analyses. And I think that, it's really, as I said before, like, I can't think of a group where DL is better. I think we should know how to do DL, but I don't think that means that we should make everyone learn DL first. I don't think we should expose patients to the risk of using DL systematically in the ED and the ICU anymore. I think the data is pretty clear on that.
Right on.
I think one other point too is that, you talked about a 5,000 patient meta-analysis published this year. I think that is a crystal clear sign that we do not need more studies on this topic. I think the jury is not out anymore. The jury has come back with a verdict.
They're home. They're enjoying dinner.
Right. They've been dismissed. They're at home.
No longer locked under key. So very good. Awesome. Well, today on our Critical Care Time Journal Club, our second one, sorry again for the delay. We've had a lot of content we've been wanting to crank out. So, but we're glad we got back to this. We talked about the device trial. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I hope you guys are now believers in video laryngoscopy, just like we are.
Yes. I hopefully we've convinced a few of you to switch. And remember, switching to using VL doesn't mean you have to give up on your DL skills. You can and should still practice DL. If you're using a standard geometry blade for VL, it's just like DL. And as I said before, just like the Mitch Hedberg joke that when an escalator breaks, it becomes stairs. Remember, a standard geometry blade where the camera gets covered by blood or something becomes DL. It's exactly the same. So practice that skill, use it, but have the better device ready because it is provably better.
Absolutely. Excellent point, Nick. I think that's really important. Main point to leave our listeners with. I think we agree that both of these skills are important, but the data just suggests that on your first pass, which is generally going to be your best look, that really should be done via a video-based system, via video laryngoscopy. If you want or need to use DL, as you said, if you're not using a hyperangulated blade, there's no reason why you can't use that video laryngoscope just like a direct laryngoscope. It's just that the data supports taking advantage of that video modality in order to get that ideal in order to optimize your time to intubation and all those other outcomes we discussed. If the data supports it, I guess we do too. And so on that note, if you want to learn more about this or other topics, you should definitely check out our website. That's going to be www.criticalcaretime.com, where you can find show notes, infographics, and more. While you're there, please take a moment to subscribe to our mailing list and leave a comment if you can. We do look forward to launching that newsletter for the mailing list here in the middle of this year, so please be on the lookout.
Yep. The newsletter is going to be a lot of fun. It's going to sort of give you links to everything we talk about, summaries, cool articles. So stay tuned, sign up. And with that, we've come to the part of the show where we like to say thanks. Thanks to all the people who have left us reviews, especially nice ones, ratings, especially 5-star ones. We really appreciate your words and suggestions, and we listen. And we're actually making episodes based on feedback you guys have given us. So keep it coming. We'd love to hear from you. You can tweet or X at us or whatever it is at CritCareTime, or us individually at Nick M. Mark at Askins_Razor. You can follow us on Instagram and Threads and check out our YouTube channel.
And of course, we would like to give a big thanks to our sponsor, C-Star Medical. We are fortunate and grateful that this episode and all episodes of Season 1 of Critical Care Time are sponsored by C-Star Medical. C-Star Medical is advancing the science of cell-directed extracorporeal therapy to help restore the balance of a dysregulated immune system in acute kidney injury and sepsis. Check out their website, cstarmedical.com. That's SEASTARMEDICAL.com to learn more.
Before we go, we'd like to thank all members of our podcast team for helping make this show possible. We really couldn't do it without the help from our producers over at Podpaste, Kurt Belknap for our theme music, and everybody else who's contributed. Disclaimers time. So this podcast and all related media, including graphics, videos, sound, are property of Critical Care Time. Please share it, but just say where you got it from.
That's right, Nick. And of course, as always, the views expressed within this podcast and any associated media do not necessarily reflect the views of our employers. All references to patients or encounters have been modified to be HIPAA compliant, and thus any similarities to real-world cases are purely coincidental. Finally, this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and should not be used in lieu of seeking medical advice. Please don't use us instead of talking to a doctor. And with that, this is Dr. Cyrus Askin. Thanks so much for listening.
And I'm Nick Mark. Thanks for listening, guys.